My friends, I am so grateful to be able to have this conversation today with my friend and conference minister, Reverend Tyler Connoley. For those of you who don't know, Tyler came into this conference very shortly before COVID hit. And after the conference had been doing a lot of intentional discerning work with the Starling Project, Tyler came in and helped our conference and continues to help our conference live into the values that were espoused during that time. And I see some themes overlap in my own ministry with that, because for the last year, we've done some cultivating around values and strove to implement those as, communal work, our own kind of Starling project, right? And that work continues today after our potluck time with some discerning work around the budget. So thank you for good modeling with that. All of this is partnership. The work that we do doesn't happen without all of us working together on it. And the conference knows that too, and I'm grateful that you're not just barking orders at us, but rather like what do we do together? Where is God calling us? Now, I asked Tyler a few months ago, hey, would you have a conversation with me? And if so, what do you want to talk about? And Tyler got this smile on their face and said, can I talk about truth and repair? And that was exciting for me. But before we get into that, as you know, I've got two things I need to do first. First, I'm going to get my cell phone out and put a 30-minute timer on, because we've got food after this, and I want to respect your dietary needs, okay? I brought Voodoo Donuts out there, and, they'll keep. And they're vegan, so they're healthy. I'm very much looking forward to those. Yeah.
Because everything vegan is healthy.
Absolutely. That's
Doritos.
Right?
Oreos.
And the second thing I would like to do is ask you how you would like to introduce yourself to us.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Reverend Tyler Connoley. I'm the conference minister for the Central Pacific Conference of the United Church of Christ. The Central Pacific Conference is all of the United Churches of Christ in Southern Washington, all of Oregon, and Southern Idaho. And so my responsibility is to support, resource, and lead the churches in this part of the country. And so we are the Central Pacific Conference together. And thank you for the way that you talked about that at the beginning. Also, I think for the context of this particular conversation, I am also a fifth-generation Oregonian. My great-great-grandmother was a homesteader in Idaho, and when she lost the farm, when her son, my great-grandfather, lost the farm, they moved to Medford. And she's buried in the Pioneer Cemetery and in Klamath Falls. And I am also the spiritual descendant of Dr. Atkinson, who was the first leader of the Congregationalists. And so as someone who has taken on the role of leading the churches in this area, I consider myself a spiritual descendant of him. He was the first one to do the work that I do. So I think those are important. Also, my pronouns are they or he. That's order of preference. So I prefer they, but I put up with he.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know sometimes we get stressed out about pronouns, not because we don't believe we ought to refer to people by them, but because we're scared we're going to get them wrong. And one of the things I appreciate about this group is that we continue to practice this together, including letting one another know when we do get it wrong. Because there's so many loved ones in our lives who are non-binary, right? And in our faith community too. So I'm grateful for that.
Can I say something about that too? Because I think it also fits with the topic of today.
Yeah.
I actually love it when people call me he and then are like, oh, I'm sorry, I meant they. Like that is as affirming as like getting it right the first time. I think that our ability to like navigate new ideas and you know, as I've come to terms with my gender identity, and the people around me have had to like figure out like our ability to like get it wrong and then say, oh, I got it wrong, is actually as affirming as getting it right.
Thank you for saying that. Grace abounds, right? Yeah. For those of us who maybe came into the Central Pacific Conference or the United Church of Christ somewhat recently, or maybe we've just never really heard what a conference is, I'm wondering if you can expound on that. What does it mean to be a conference, and what does being a conference minister mean?
So, I mean, really, I think the conference is, in the United Church of Christ, is a collection of churches in a particular region, and it is it's kind of an affinity group. It's in the same way that we are members of our local church. Our churches are members of the conference, and it's a relationship of a covenant relationship, which for me means a named relationship of mutual support and accountability, where the conference says, you can count on me for these things, to give you the wisdom of the wider community, to connect you to other churches. And the conference says, I need to count on you to love our neighbors where you are, and to be the church in your place for your time. And so, unlike other denominations where, you know, a diocese is kind of a top-down structure, in the United Church of Christ, a conference is a covenantal relationship of mutuality and accountability to one another in mutuality.
Thank you. Now, we speak a lot about our relationships within the UCC being covenantal, and I'm wondering what that looks like in practice. Because a lot of us, if we came from a more conservative background, we may have a very different picture in our mind of what covenant means than what the UCC means, what the United Church of Christ means, what you mean.
Yeah. So I think that sometimes covenant is used as almost like a bludgeon.
Yeah.
And in a biblical perspective and from a God perspective, it is never that. When God creates covenants with people, God always allows that person to have full autonomy in the relationship. And in covenantal relationships, that ability to enter the relationship and the mutuality of that relationship is really important. It's also a relationship of accountability, because in a covenant, and covenants, like the conference has a covenant with your pastor, and it's a written document, right, that says, I don't know if we have one yet, but it's something that we're supposed to have, that we're supposed to put in place with all of the clergy in the conference. It's a written document that says, here are my responsibilities in this relationship, here are your responsibilities in this relationship, here's how you can count on me, here's how I'm counting on you. And it acknowledges that it is mutual.
Yeah.
And so I think when I think about covenant, it's those things that are, it's mutual, it is named and accountable. And then the other piece of it is that covenant for us is always made in the presence of God who is love. And that the God who is love is the binding force in all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What part of why that matters to me, part of why I have a relationship with United Church of Christ, is because without accountability and like a clearly understood accountability, this role can become abusive without recourse. And it's important to me that you know, if you have problems with me, you can go to our board. You can also go to the conference, right? Because I don't want this ever turning into a cult, and it never needs to. It doesn't have to do that. No reason for that to happen. It's also part of why I try to model vulnerability up front and talk about things like, I don't know, my quirks, because I don't want to put this false presentation of who I am, and then I'm, we're doing culty things. No, we could do nerdy things. We could have fun and geek out. We're going to avoid the, Giuseppe's the figurehead of the church stuff. Besides, you guys would never put up with that anyway, right? Right. But I love that is an expectation throughout this conference. This is not an oddity. This is a feature. Now, let's start getting into the quotes that we had up on here, because we had kind of a conversation before the conversation, and I want to see where that goes. I'm looking forward to that. So you provided this Brene Brown quote, and I appreciate it. The book Dare to Lead was recommended to me by Sarah Rosenau, who I interned under, and it's one of those books that have influenced my leadership perspective. And I'm wondering why you chose this particular quote to start us off with. And can we put it up again? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Which one do you want to put up?
The Brene Brown quote, the People's Testimony. Thank you. Oh,
Yeah,
there's a picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't give you the quote. My bad.
So.
But you could see her. That's
yeah,
good.
Yeah. I'm glad that Pastor Sarah recommended this book to you. I actually read this book with my supervisor when I was in the Missouri Mid-South Conference on conference staff. And I actually didn't start with the quote. I came to the quote later when I was thinking about the story of David and about the psalm that was the text for today. And so can I tell you the story, a little bit of what led up to the psalm?
Oh, we don't tell stories here. Please do.
Okay. So let me just read you a bit of the psalm that we didn't read. This is the very beginning of the psalm. It says, "A psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him just after he had been with Bathsheba." And so that's the context for this psalm for today. And the story of David and Bathsheba is, it's a Bible story, and the Bible is sometimes terrible. So I want to just warn you ahead of time. It's a story that includes rape and murder and It's not a story for children. We're told that David, so people's houses had flat roofs, and the roof had a wall around it, and so the roof was a place where you had an indoor space that you could do outdoor things. And we're told that King David, whose house was above everybody else's on a hill, was looking down and saw a woman bathing on her roof, which would have been in her house. But he could see into her house because he was the king. And he thought she was beautiful, and he commanded his guards to go get her. Said, I want that woman. And they went and got her, and he slept with her, and he sent her home. And we now would call that rape. She didn't have a choice. When the guards came to get her, she didn't get to choose. And then he found out later that she was pregnant. Her husband was in the military and was serving for David. And so there was no way it could be her husband's son or child. And so David sent to the front lines. I think David was like, oh, I can fix this. He sent to the front lines for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, to come and get her, or to come home. But Uriah wouldn't sleep with his wife because his men were all sleeping on the battlefield, and he cared about his men, I think, in a way that David didn't. And so then David was like, oh, I can fix this. And he invited Uriah up to his house and was like, I'm going to get him drunk. And then maybe he'll go home and he'll sleep with his wife. Well, Uriah didn't. He got drunk, he went home, he slept on the ground. He's like, all my men are sleeping on the ground, I'm not going to sleep in my house. And so at that point, David said, we don't know what he thought, because it's the Bible and you don't get internal monologue in the Bible, but I think he thought, oh, I can fix this. And so he wrote a letter and had Uriah take the letter to the front line. Uriah trusted him and didn't read the letter, and he knew Uriah trusted him and wouldn't read the letter. And the letter said, you need to make sure that this man dies. Put him in the fiercest battle. If the battle is going badly, pull back. Make sure he dies. And he had him murdered. And after he had him murdered, then he married Bathsheba. And he thought everything would be okay. And the prophet Nathan, who was someone who could tell David things that he didn't want to hear, came to him and said, I know what you did. He called him in. He didn't call him out, but he told him, I know what you did. And I think at that moment, David realized all that he had done. And that's the context. Psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him just after he had been with Bathsheba. And then listen to the things that David says. Have mercy on me, O God. I know my wrongdoings, my sin is always right in front of me.
Can we put those words up? This is the Psalm 51 words.
I've sinned against you, you alone. I've committed evil in your sight. Later, I was born in guilt, in sin, from the moment my mother conceived me. And so I was thinking about shame and guilt and truth and repair. And I thought about this psalm. And I thought about when I read for 7.5 years this particular psalm, told that story and read this psalm with people in recovery. And when people in recovery read this psalm, they had a different perspective than I did. They saw this language and taught me to see these first few verses as shame language. I can't stop thinking about what I did. I think about it day and night. And they would be like, yeah, that's why I drink. Like, because I can't stop thinking about all the wrong things I've done. And then he says, I've sinned against you, you alone, God. And they were like, what? He raped Bathsheba, he killed her husband, he forced those guards to go do his will, he wrote that letter, and he says he sinned against God alone? Like, what kind of nonsense is that?
I do feel like I've heard it plenty, though, especially like when a pastor gets in trouble and it gets in the news before they bring him back into the fold. They're like, oh, I'm very contrite. I made a terrible mistake. I know that I sinned against God. Uh-huh. And other people.
Right.
Oh, but I'm only going to mention God.
Right. Yeah. And so there's a man named Brian Stevenson, and Brian Stevenson says, everyone is more than the worst thing they ever did. And Brian Stevenson worked with people on death row, and that is one of the ways that he talks about shame, that everyone is more than the worst thing they ever did. And shame says you are the worst thing you ever did. You are a liar. You lied to me. You are now forever a liar. David is forever a rapist, forever a murderer. That's his identity. And shame also says, as David does at the beginning of this poem, look, I've always been guilty. I was born bad. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just a bad person.
So I'm glad you're bringing this up, because for those of us who grew up with an understanding of original sin, this is one of the passages that people bring out, right? And the passage we read last week about Adam and Eve sitting in the garden and losing Eden, right? But he's not talking about original sin. That's an idea hundreds and hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
He's talking about himself.
Yeah. And in fact, so I think one of the things about the Bible, and those of us who are raised like you and I were raised, is there's this, the inherent word of God, and the idea that, and I think particularly with the Psalms, we forget that they're poetry.
Yeah.
Right? We forget that when David was writing, he was writing from his own experience. He wasn't writing as the voice of God.
Yeah.
He was writing from his own experience. And as our spiritual ancestor, we can look at his story and be like, oh, what can I learn from your story? Right? And I was raised to believe that this was the word of that psalm, like he was speaking for God and saying in God's voice that he was sinful from birth. And what the people in recovery helped me see was that what he was actually saying was stinking thinking.
Yeah.
That's the language that they would use. They'd be like, oh, like this, the first 5 verses of this are stinking thinking. And then he says, but you, God, require the truth. And Brian Stevenson, who I have already talked about, says truth and reconciliation are always sequential. They are never simultaneous. You tell the truth, and then maybe you can reconcile. And I came to realize that it's the realization that he needed to start being honest that then allowed the later parts of this psalm where he's able to say, create in me a clean heart, allow me to tell the truth in my secret heart. And heart here is mind.
Yeah.
Because in Hebrew, if you think about, if you didn't know what the body looked like and you saw this thing that was in the middle of your body and it had these tendrils that went out to the rest of the body, they were like, oh, that's the nerve center. That's that's the command center of the body, is this thing right here in the middle of your chest, and it's in the middle of you, so it must be your mind.
Right.
So in Hebrew, when you read heart, you're talking about mind.
If you're wondering what the heart is, it's the bowels. So the emotional center is your bowels.
Center. Yeah, and your kidneys especially.
And your kidneys.
When you fall in love with someone, you say,
you're like, oh, my kidneys are aflutter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those of you who, had to use the bathroom a lot when you're courting, now you know why.
Yeah. and so you asked me, why did I choose the Brene Brown quote?
Yeah.
That's where I got to Brene Brown, because I was like, oh, I remember that Brene Brown talked about taking responsibility and about guilt and shame, and how shame keeps us from taking responsibility. Because if we believe that we're broken, if we believe that we are like the worst thing we ever did, it interrupts our ability to do anything about it. But guilt and telling the truth allows us to be like, oh, I actually hurt someone. I want to repair that. And so that's where I came, where I was like, oh, I need to spend some more time with Brene Brown, and I need to think about shame and guilt. And from Brian Stevenson about truth and repair. And this, for me, is really connected to the work that we're doing in the conference, and the work of seeing if we can tell the truth, a more complicated truth about our history as settler colonialism, settler colonialists, about the ways that the United Church of Christ has participated in the particular ways that racism has shown up in Oregon and in southern Idaho. And if we can begin to tell more truthful stories about our history, then maybe we can find a way toward repair and toward reconciliation.
So one of the things that I'm struck about that with is Portland has a reputation for being such a progressive space, right? We also kind of have a reputation, progressive white people in Portland, amongst especially some of our more marginalized communities, of being pretty self-congratulatory about it. And if we question it, if we question our heritage or our privilege or how we got to the point we're at, we start getting real antsy. We feel really fragile, I think, but maybe we don't identify it with those words. Our bowels and kidneys start going aflutter. Right? The easy thing to do would be, as a conference, to say, yeah, guys, we are really progressive, and the UCC's been leading the charge on that. But it takes faith, I think, and courage, and hope to actually look at the hard stuff together. I don't know, that's just something I wanted to share. Yeah. And if you've ever been that person who's felt really fragile about looking at your own, either direct wrongdoing or like the privilege you've inherited, or maybe mistakes that you just made and you didn't realize you made it until later, I've had those experiences too. And I think it is hard work to look at this, but it can be really good work.
Yeah. I want to be the kind of person who can be honest when I make mistakes. And I also want to have descendants who will be honest about my mistakes, who will take responsibility to repair harm and I'm trying to do that for my ancestors too. And I think that, so I'm going to put in a plug. Next month, or the end of this month, we're going to be and on the Umatilla Reservation telling some stories about our church's participation in the attempted genocide against the Cayuse people. And in the aftermath of the killings at the Whitman Mission, also our participation in getting to the point of the killings at Whitman Mission, and also Dr. Atkinson, my spiritual ancestor, not my ancestor, but in my role, my spiritual ancestor, his participation in that, and also in the Indian school at Forest Grove, and the harm that was done at Forest Grove. And one of the things that happens when I start to tell more truthful stories about Dr. Atkinson is that people say to me, "How dare you?
Yeah.
He was a good person. Like, don't you know? Like, we wouldn't have public education in Oregon without him. He was a champion for Indians. That's why he was a champion for the Indian school." And I think that we need to be able to move from that shame language to guilt language, and to be able to say, yes, of course, he was complicated and he did lots of good things and I don't know what his motives were. And he harmed people. And if we can repair that harm, then let's try to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that he would be glad for me to repair any harm that he did. And I would be glad for my descendants to do the same thing for me. You know?
Yeah.
And you know, going back to the very beginning, it's like and we're out of time, so this is perfect. Going back to the thing about pronouns, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's actually super affirming when someone uses the wrong pronouns and then says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I meant," right? And I think if more of us can do that, if more of us can be the kind of people who live into the discomfort of guilt and get away from the traps of shame, I think the better off the world will be.
I agree. It's one of the hardest things, I think. You know, I apologize to Brio when I have outsized responses, because I get anxious, you know. We did Comic-Con yesterday, and I've shared with several people, I'm just now realizing that all of the really special memories that I have with my family about these like grand events we did, they must have been so stressed out, because yesterday was awesome and so stressful and hot and stinky. Ugh. And so we got home and Brio's all amped up and his cousins are amped up. You know, we had a great time, but also like they gotta go to bed. If you're wondering why aren't they here, they've got like a convention hangover from just too much excitement. And I got really stressed out when I was making dinner, and Brio got really stressed out, and he did some alone time to calm down, and I apologized to him once he was calm. Like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have yelled. And he's like, Dad, I'm really sorry too. I'm a bad kid. I'm like, you're not a bad kid. You're not a bad kid. You're a hungry kid.
Right.
You know? I didn't like that you did this. That hurt my body and that hurt my feelings. But you're a great kid. You're 6 years old and you're figuring stuff out. And so many of us could have used that growing up, right? I remember the very first time a grown-up apologized to me. This will come up in a sermon at some point, just warning you. Sometimes I repeat myself. But I hit 40, and I'm a dad now, so I feel like I can do that. I can repeat stories, right? When you hit middle age, you can do that, I hear. I had an abusive father, and then I moved into the care of my mom and my stepfather. And during one of their very first arguments, they were yelling at each other, and I stood in front of my mom, and I said, if you want to hit her, you have to go through me, because the stuff that kept me up at night was being 4 years old, the memories of my biological father hurting my mom. My dad, my stepdad, David, was crushed. And he left and he went on a walk for like an hour. And it felt like a really long walk. And he came back and he got down on a knee and he said, we shouldn't have argued in front of you. I'm very sorry. I'm never going to hurt you. And I'm never going to hurt your mom. And that's always left such a deep mark on me. That's who I want to be. That's how I want to live. I don't want to be like taking a page from the leadership books that I see all around us that says never apologize until you have to, right? That's not who we're called to be. All right, well, you got a bonus message. Thank you so much.
Yeah.